If you wanted to destroy what Christians believe, where would you start? You'd start with the most pivotal point of the religion, the one belief that everything else is hinged on, and that is Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Welcome back to Hard Questions with Elena. I am really excited for today. I've got a really exciting topic prepared for you guys. I can't wait to dive in. In my last video, and if you haven't watched that one, you might want to go back and watch it before watching this one, just because it gives a little bit of background about what we're going to be talking about today. But I mentioned something about Jesus resurrecting from the grave. And to most people, that would sound really sketchy. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've never seen anyone come back to life. And so that's what I want to look at today. From a purely historical standpoint, is it even possible that Jesus rose from the dead? The reason this topic is so important is because the entire religion of Christianity is hinged on it. If Jesus didn't come back to life, then all the hope, all the eternal life, everything that I talked about in my last video is gone. If Jesus didn't really come back to life, then we're all serving a dead person who is dead. So how do you even start an investigation like this? I did a lot of my research by reading a book called A Case for Easter by a man named Lee Strobel. He had a really cool story. He was a journalist for the Chicago Tribune who set out to prove that the resurrection of Jesus Christ never took place. He wasn't a Christian and he wanted to prove that it wasn't true. So he wrote a book explaining all the questions he asked, the people he talked to, all the steps that he took. So we're going to kind of follow in his footsteps and see the conclusions that he came up with. The best place to start is by examining if Jesus was even dead in the first place. I mean, you can't come back to life if you were never dead to begin with, right? One popular belief is called the swoon theory, and it states that Jesus never actually died on the cross, he simply passed out, and then when he appeared to be resurrected, he had just revived himself. I'm going to warn you, the next part of this video might be a little gruesome, because in order to investigate this possibility, we have to look into Roman crucifixion practices. Crucifixion means death by hanging on a cross, and it's the type of death that Jesus is recorded to have died. Even before reaching the crucifixion site, victims endured excruciating torture. Flogging, for instance, was when they were whipped with a leather lash with metal balls on the ends. These beatings normally consisted of 39 strikes, but having more wasn't uncommon. This beatings ripped the skin of the back open from the shoulders down to the bottom. A lot of victims would have died from these beatings alone, but even if they didn't, they probably would have experienced something known as hypovolemic shock from loss of blood. Actually, we have proof that Jesus experienced hypovolemic shock from the Bible because it records that he was thirsty while on the cross, which is a symptom of having lost a lot of blood, and also that he was way too weak to carry his cross to Calvary, his crucifixion site. Once reaching the crucifixion site, prisoners endured even more excruciating torture, like having 7-inch stakes driven through their wrists and nails to keep them up on the cross. When they were up in their position on the cross, their shoulders would have immediately become dislocated from the pressure of their lower body pulling down on them. And their lungs would have been locked into the inhale position, meaning that in order to exhale, they would have had to push up on the stakes driven through their wrists to let out their breath. Therefore, death by crucifixion was a really slow process of waiting for the victim to die of cardiac arrest. I'm sorry, but there's actually more. Even before death, the hypovolemic shock and accelerated heart rate would have led to a buildup of a clear-like liquid around the heart called a pericardial effect. Why this is important, you might want to know, is because the Bible actually confirms this. They say that once soldiers were fairly sure that Jesus was dead, they stabbed his side, and when they removed the spear, a clear liquid, water it's described as, and blood flowed out. The liquid buildup around the heart would have appeared like water, therefore confirming the pericardial effect. Also, can we just acknowledge the fact that Jesus was stabbed? Roman soldiers had the responsibility of making sure that the victims came off of the cross dead. Actually, if anyone managed to survive the crucifixion process, the Roman soldiers would pay for that with their own lives. These men were professional killers. Therefore, we can be really certain that they would not have let Jesus come down alive. He was most certainly dead. So, what now? I mean, we've established that Jesus was actually dead, but was his tomb actually empty? I mean, if someone came to you and claimed that your dead grandma had come back from the dead, the first place you would look would be her tomb. If she was still buried, we can be safe to say that grandma's not alive. There are 4 books of the Bible that record the crucifixion and resurrection story. They are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Before you get all scared and say, don't bring the Bible into this, don't worry. We're going to test these like we do everything to see if they're accurate. Christians regard these accounts as eyewitness testimonies of what happened surrounding Jesus' death. For the sake of time, we're not going to read all of them here, but we do need to look into them because they're the only records we have of what actually went down. If they're not true, then you can forget the whole thing. The most famous argument against the validity of these 4 accounts is that they seem to contradict each other. Here we have 4 friends recording what they say was a historical event, and their stories don't match up. For instance, one records that 2 women went to the tomb in the morning, the other records that 4 did. One records that the women were overjoyed when they saw the empty tomb, the other records that they were terrified. How could these men possibly be telling the truth when their stories are so different? Well, would you be surprised if I told you that their differences actually confirm their validity, not negate it? In court, when jurors are listening to witnesses' testimonies, they look for differences in the story. 2 people that witness the same event are going to pick up on different details. However, if 2 people converse beforehand and fabricate a story, their stories will be exactly the same. Historians use the same logic when looking at the gospel accounts. They say that because these men recorded slightly different details, it actually validates their accuracy. So what other proof do we have that these accounts aren't just some conspiracy or legend? Well, to start off, the book of Mark dates extremely early. Some say even to 37 AD. This would have been just a few years after Jesus' death. Legends always arise after the original eyewitnesses have all died out. Corruption never takes place while there's people around who can verify the account. And yet this account was recorded while all the original characters were still living. Other proof arises from the story itself. For example, it's not at all the type of story first century Jews would have invented if they were trying to make it look accurate or trustworthy. For example, the story features women who were the ones to discover the empty tomb in the morning. However, in first century Jewish culture, a woman's testimony was regarded as nothing. They weren't even allowed to testify in a court of law. The gospel writers featured women as their alibi, exposing them to ridicule or even embarrassment. This means that there was no possible reason they would feature women unless they were telling the truth. Another unlikely character is a man named Joseph of Arimathea. He was a member of the Jewish council who was recorded to have asked for Jesus' body after he was killed on the cross and buried it in his own tomb. The reason he's such a shocker is because at the time, the early church was very much at odds with the Jewish council. Remember, the Jewish council were the ones who sentenced Jesus to death in the first place. If the writers of the gospel were making up the story, there's no way they would have featured a member of the Jewish council as one of the good guys. They were telling the truth. Other proof for the story arises from the fact that Jesus' tomb was in a well-known location. It was in the very town where people could go and check and see if his body was still there. It's completely illogical to suppose that a new religion, Christianity, founded on the belief that Jesus rose from the dead would gain traction in a town where people knew he was still resting in the grave. The last and perhaps most convincing piece of evidence we have that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't making up their accounts is that they all died for what they recorded. If they had stolen the body of Jesus and were making up a lie about the resurrection, there's no way they would have been tortured and killed for a lie. Now, all that we've talked about up till this point is great. I mean, we've proven that Jesus actually died and that his grave was actually empty. But what good does that do us? I mean, I don't know about you, but if I heard that someone's grave was empty, my first thought would not be that they had come back to life. I'd probably think that their body was stolen or some misunderstanding like that. No, in order to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus actually came back to life, we need people who saw him alive again after death. So do we have eyewitness testimonies of people who saw Jesus after raising from the dead? Yes, actually many of them. I'm going to flash up on the screen here a list of all the people who were recorded to have seen Jesus after death. And for the sake of time, we're not going to go into all of them, but I do want to focus in on a few very important ones. One specific sighting comes from another book of the Bible called 1 Corinthians. It records that Jesus appeared to 500 people at one time. Now, why this specific sighting is significant is because it proves that this could not have been a hallucination. One common theory, often used to discredit the sightings of Jesus, says that maybe the witnesses were just hallucinating when they thought they saw him. However, according to Dr. Gary Collins, hallucinations are an individual thing. You are the only one who can see what's in front of you. If Jesus appeared to 500 people at one time, we can be sure that they weren't all hallucinating the same thing at the same time. So, what do we do with all of this? I mean, it seems to me that we just proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus really rose from the dead. But can we even believe that logically? I mean, it seems to contradict all reason. I'll tell you what I did with it. I chose faith. You see, with history, we will never be able to prove something beyond a shadow of a doubt. Sure, the evidence seems to stack up on one side of the equation, but at the end of the day, it always comes back to faith. I chose to put my faith in the most logical, the most thing that makes sense, as we all try to do. But that's the beauty of this particular situation. It is illogical. It makes no sense to believe that someone could come back to life, and yet it happened. And that truth gives me so much joy. You guys know what I believe, but I would love to hear from you and hear where you're putting your faith. You guys know that you can write me an email. My email address is hardquestions.withelena@gmail.com. I love to hear your questions, comments, concerns. All of that is great. Guys, I hope that this video has helped you realize why Christians love Easter so much, what it's all about, and maybe even reconsider the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. I hope you guys have a great week. See you next time. Bye.